don't you?
Um, within um, Zoom or
Yeah.
elsewhere?
No, there is a facility for recording the transcript.
Um,
I don't remember where it is.
and
All right.
so we're back into recording mode.
Yeah.
So okay, so Barbara, thank you for this opportunity to have a conversation and as an informal interview, if you will, um, about your experience of taking on the editorship and publishing of the Knowing Field, the international journal of systemic constellations practice, the only English language journal on the theme of systemic constellations work and the development of the field as a area of professional practice. So perhaps the first question I should ask you really is how did you come to get into this role of being an editor and a publisher of an international professional journal?
Well, firstly, let me thank you for offering to do the interview, because I hadn't considered doing an interview prior to this. A couple of people have mentioned it in a casual way, but I hadn't picked it up and grabbed it or anything. And there was something about the way you asked me that had some force behind it or something that I responded positively to it. So yeah, I'm grateful to you for that. So back in 2000 and what would it be? Between 2000 and 2003, I was very friendly with Barbara Stones. I didn't know Jutta ten Herkel quite so well, but the two of them were editing the Systemic Solutions Bulletin, and they were doing it once a year. And because I was friendly with her, I knew the process and what was going on. And then I can't remember how I ended up helping her with the editing, but I did. And I say her because there was a point where the two of them, Jutta and Barbara, separated, and Barbara was just doing it by herself. And I don't remember which issue that happened with, because there were 4 issues of the Systemic Solutions Bulletin.
Okay.
Um, and I was definitely deputy editor by the 4th one, but I don't remember, whether it was between 2 and 3 or 3 and 4 that I took that role on. And I really loved doing the editing, really loved it. I'd never done any editing before. When I've done translation work, and I have kind of edited translation work, so I guess I'd done a little bit of that sort of stuff, but nothing in this field. And of course, I was very interested in constellation work at that time. And Barbara found it stressful doing it, and she got to the point where she was ready to give up. And we had a meeting, and she was kind of, and I understand it now, she was ambivalent about whether to close it, to let it go completely, or whether to pass it on to me. So we had several discussions about it. And of course, we were in a field of ambivalence. I was also ambivalent about, do I want to pick up this journal? I can see it's hard work. And I remember saying to her, I've got this image of a boat on potentially quite turbulent waters. Do I want to pick up this, get myself on this boat and be the captain? So it was an interesting transitional place that the two of us were in, really. And thanks to her, she sort of said, look, let's just be businesslike about this and not get into, all the emotional stuff around it, and we'll just decide. So I don't know if I had to go away and decide, or whether I decided then and there, and I thought, oh, I'll just do it, So it was kind of like that. And then when I did, some new energy came in for me, and I got really excited about it. And I didn't like the name Systemic Solutions Bulletin, because for me, constellation work has never been about solutions. And I know a lot of people use the word systemic, but it feels hard somehow,
Mm.
the word hard-edged or something like that. So I was talking to Francesca, and she was saying about, you know, her origins are half Shoshone, and she was talking about the indigenous, their knowing all about the knowing field way before constellation work came in, and her worry about disrespect for that knowing field place. So I assumed the words the knowing field came from her, or from her origins, her ancestral origins. So I asked her, can I use this name for the journal? And she said, oh, no, that's not come from me. That came from Albrecht. So Albrecht Marr coined the term the knowing field. So that was interesting. That was an interesting, even though the indigenous that she's part of had known about it, but the name the knowing field was coined by Albrecht Marr. So I
Barbara,
wrote,
could I just ask, could you
yeah,
say a little about Albrecht, just in terms of contextualizing him in the
yeah.
journey, or in your journey, basically?
Yeah, I mean, he was one of the veterans, as far as I'm concerned. I hope you won't mind me calling him a veteran. So historically in England, Bert first came in 1996. No, was it 96? Yes, 96, that's right. And it was Hunter Beaumont and the Gestalt Centre in London that invited him. So
Okay.
Hunter Beaumont was accompanying him all the time at that stage. And I just finished my Gestalt training, interestingly. I was training at the Gestalt Centre. I found this piece of paper on the table, you know, never done anything like that before, and was just completely grabbed by it and went to the first seminar. After, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, something like that, because Hunter was coming twice a year and running 5-day workshops.
Mm.
And after the first 5-day one, he added a 3-day supervision. So it was 8 days twice a year was my training.
Okay.
plus traveling around to see Bert, you know, and I saw him in various countries. So that was, you know, that there was no training then, but that was my training. And after a certain time, Hunter pulled back from that. And as he pulled back, Albrecht stepped in. And I
Right.
don't know if that was as a result of liaison between the two of them, or whether it just evolved organically.
Mm.
But Albrecht began coming and running workshops after Hunter stepped back a bit. I mean, he stepped back from that, but he did other things afterwards. So I was involved with Hunter for a long time. And I didn't have a lot of involvement with Albrecht in those early days. I think I went to 1 or 2 of his workshops. And then I invited him on my first training that I did in the UK. So then I got to know him better, obviously. So for me, he's always been around.
Right.
And when I was doing the annual intensives in Germany, and that started around the same sort of time, 2000, 2001. And I went, I think, to almost every one. He was there. So I
Mm.
got to know him there as well. So that's how Albrecht has come about. In a way, he was part of the original crowd.
Right.
Hunter Beaumont, Gunther Weber, Albrecht Marr, Ursula Franke, Victoria Schnee, Victoria Schnabel, probably forgotten a few. Stefan Hausner was around then, but he wasn't in the same tight-knit group, I don't think. You know,
Okay.
he knew Bert
Okay.
way back. Yeah, so that was the history of how Albrecht came onto the scene. Yeah. So yes, I took over the journal, and I doubled the size, and I went from once a year to twice a year.
Mm.
So I got this burst of energy, and it was great, you know, and I really enjoyed it. Um, and I was excited by it because it was at the same time as my excitement about the constellation work, you know, it was new, and, you know, I was learning on a fast learning curve with it, and doing the annual thing in Germany and all the rest of it. So it all fitted together. What I didn't have, and in a way I still don't have, is the kind of profit-making business head. And when I look back at that, poor old Ty Francis, I mean, I brought him onto the advisory board because I knew he was a very, I mean, he's a corporate man really, but he's very organized and he knows how to create business and that sort of stuff. And he did his best to get me into a business orientated mode with it, but I just could never embrace that. And when I look back, I think it would have been far more beneficial for me and for the journal to have got some help from somewhere to form a non-profit something or other, a community
Okay.
share
Yeah.
company. I don't know the exact terminology, but I think that would have certainly helped, because what happened was that, I made a big loss for quite a long time,
Right.
and then it broke even, and it's never really made a profit.
Okay.
It's just floated along, and I've subsidized it, but now it does break even now. But it's never been a kind of a money spinner for me. But that was not, you know, I probably needed more help in terms of why am I doing it, in those early days, because I only realized retrospectively it wasn't what was driving me. It wasn't, oh, here's a money-making enterprise at all. It never was.
So it sounds like it was very much a passion project from the
Yeah,
get-go.
yeah, yeah. And it
And
was about sort of honoring the work, honoring the inclusivity of the work, in a way, the essence of what constellation work is about. And I think that's why, just leap into the end now, it's so hard for me to pass on the baton, because I hold that so dear.
mm,
And I'm not saying there's nobody out there that couldn't subscribe to that. Of course, that's not true, but I asked a few key people who I knew would subscribe to it, and they all said no, they didn't want it. It's hard work. So yes, so that was the original thing. And with Barbara and I, it was a sort of difficult process to tease apart from each other. And one of the things, big learning for me, was that she and Jutta really needed some acknowledgement, that they were the founders.
yes.
In a way, I had an adopted child. That's how I see it. um, and like you do when you're an adoptive parent, you change the name often of the child and this sort of thing. So I saw the analogy there, and I realized that, I needed to really acknowledge them. And so from then on, I put in the beginning of the journal, founded as the Systemic Solutions Bulletin by Barbara Stearns and Jutta ten Heckel. And that did something important for both of us, I think. But it was a teasing apart for a spell.
Mm.
It wasn't
And
an easy process.
once you'd recognized that process needed to occur, once that process had happened, did you at any time invite them to contribute to subsequent editions, or was that teasing apart, as you put it, um, a more definitive separation, so to
I
speak?
think it was a more definitive separation. I'm racking my brains now. I don't think they submitted any articles. I can't remember. I just certainly didn't actively say, would you like to submit something? I don't remember doing that at all.
Okay.
So probably not. No.
And in that first period, let's say that first 5 years or so, what did you hope to achieve, and what do you think you did achieve in terms of the range of content and, if you like, the orientation of the journal as you became as you exercised your role as editor?
Well, it'd be interesting to look back and see what I wrote as my mission statement, because certainly as I think about it now, it was to mirror what I see as the essence of constellation work, is to let it freely evolve. As you were saying, it's not a stagnant process, it's a movement, and it's still moving. And I do remember Bert saying that, about wanting constellation work not to become fixed, You know, he came out of Catholicism, you know, the dogma of Catholicism, and talked a lot about how the essence of all these things is pure, but the dogma comes from fixing things and putting a boundary around it and saying this is inside and that's outside, them and us, war, you know. So that was the essence of what I wanted for the journal, to kind of be all embracing, to gather. I mean, of course, once or twice I did exclude articles, but basically to have a basic attitude of inclusivity, that your view matters, you know, and to do the same in terms of the range, like organizational, nature, personal stories. In the early days, there were more personal stories, personal constellations, that kind of thing. So to develop a range and to work in a mostly responsive way. But alongside that, Francesca has been like a mole, you know, she's kind of, she travels a lot and she's all going all over the world, and she's had her nose to the ground the whole time. And she has this kind of, oh, you know, if you feel passionate about that, you must write an article, you know. And so she's really been a stalwart of the work and helping me behind the scenes a lot. I'm really grateful to her.
And when you say Francesca, are you referring to?
Francesca Mason Boring.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And have there been other colleagues that have supported you in a comparable way, whether formally or informally, in those early years or throughout the course of your editorship?
I mean, a lot, you know, I get a bit nervous when you ask that question because I think, oh, I'm going to miss out somebody important, you know. So obviously Hunter, I mean, I carried on working with Hunter after he left doing that formal constellation stuff, because he started to run a group in Edinburgh and I joined that. So I was in that group for 11 years. And I think we met 2 or 3 times a year, same sort of format really. And then I was doing the annual intensive in Germany. So Bert consistently supported me with the journal, even through the split. You know, there were a couple of journals, I think, which didn't have an article from him in. And, you know, I don't know what went on there internally, but I kept approaching him and saying, you know, will you please send me an article? And he got to a certain point where he just said, carte blanche, you know, you're welcome to use anything from any of my books. And he always wrote afterwards and said, thank you very much for the journal. So there was a consistent contact with Bert. So beyond that, Colette Green, who's in Ireland, has been sort of, it's interesting because she is quietly spoken. She's been quietly there all the time and as a sort of moral support. And she did Bert's training as well. So she had that sort of input. And it's interesting, as I think of these people, she's like a sort of been a constant.
Yes.
Not in a sort of forceful frontline way, but there in the background. And I always knew I could write to her and say, you know, what do you think about this? And get a sort of balanced response from her. So, gosh, I'm starting to feel emotional now as I'm talking about these people. Yeah.
Well, that seems like a good thing to me, that there is that presence and depth of emotion in recalling these people.
So, I mean, she was important to me. And then the other person was Jen Altman, who died a couple of years ago. And she was she was a professional editor before. So I would bring her in towards the end because she had that sort of editing expertise. So very different to Colette's role, if you like, but kind of she was more at the front line in the detailed bit.
Right.
And that was very difficult when she died. You know, it was a kind of I wasn't ready for her to die, like not yet. And she's older than me, but you know, that was a bit of a shock. I lost her as a editing companion at the end of the process. Francesca's been there at the beginning, getting the articles, and at the end. She's helped a lot, with the editing.
Mm.
As I said about Ty, he would kind of, if I got in a mess business-wise, I'd have some contact with him, and he would kind of, if you like, haul me in and go right, there's this, and help with the focused, getting more focused if I got overwhelmed, because the
Right.
flip side of inclusivity is it can get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you need to do this somehow. So he certainly helped with that.
And
Trying to think who else in those early days. Well, interestingly, when I took over, my ex-husband was a graphic designer, and he did the graphic design. So I don't remember what issue that changed. He probably did 4 or 5 issues, and we were already divorced. So it was an interesting process doing that. And probably it was another entanglement looking back. And it was probably healthy when I separated business-wise from him as well. And I did 2 or 3 journals. I found another graphic designer who was brilliant, but he was too expensive. And I learned from that, that actually I ended up paying more than I was getting, than I was charging for the journal. It's crazy. And at that point, a really important person was Jane Peterson, who I'd kind of knew, but didn't know well. And she was coming to Edinburgh for some reason. And I remember having a meeting with her, and she was so helpful and supportive. And I'm very grateful to her. And she was around and on the board for some time. And I can't remember what happened. She bought a house, or, she got involved with some project of her own in the States. And so, we moved apart, but we've still got good contact when we are in touch. So she was another figural person in those early days. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I've had a few people who have been friends, like I asked for people if they wanted to put a regular donation in and be a friend of the journal. And I've had Cecilia Rigojo, who's regularly contributed something, John Whittington, Snay Victoria Schnabel. Is that it? I think that might be it. And Alan Reynolds, I kind of wrote to him last week and said, do you want to submit a last advert? He has consistently put an advert in the journal, every single one, all the way through. So that feels like a support. I mean, obviously it's helped him as well in terms of his advertising, but he's been a sort of background supporting person. So after this brilliant graphic designer, I was like, okay, I've got to find something that is more affordable, even though these are beautiful journals. And he did produce 3 or 4, I can't remember how many. I asked Jane Peterson, and Lou Bosch, who's my designer now, was her designer, and she said he's great, and he's been with me ever since. So that, I think that was around issue 18 he took over.
When would that have been in time terms?
Oh, now you're asking me.
Approximately.
Yeah. Well, I started in 2004 with issue 5. And then it was 2 issues a year. We'd have to work that out, wouldn't we? I don't know. I can find it. We could slot that in. I mean, I could find it now if you wanted me to.
No, it's fine. We can get that detail later.
18 till now. And then it was issue 23, where I decided I can't afford to carry on doing hard copy. It's got to go online. So that was a policy decision. And I used to, with policy decisions, write to the whole advisory board and say, what do you think? Because that was a really big letting go for me, because I loved the hard copy. But it became completely unrealistic, because cost for the States, for South Africa, Australia, those sort of places, for the delivery was more than the cost of the journal. So it just became totally unmanageable. So sadly, I had to let go of the hard copy at that point. And I did lose some subscribers as a result, of course. But I like to think maybe I gained a few more, I don't know. And two other important people for me have been Max Dauscott and his wife Alemka. Now, they, in the first place, have submitted some really amazing articles over all the years, but also, maybe I'm jumping a bit here, with Max, he came to the fore when ISCA, you know, the sort of next stage with ISCA happened. Maybe I'll leave that until a bit further down the line. So they've been consistent supporters, he and Alemka. Trying to think if there's anybody else. If I think of anybody else, I'll slot it in the redraft. Yeah, so I don't want to forget anybody, you know, who's been really figural for me. Yeah, so those have been and you know, one thing I discovered was that the sending out work to be edited and gathering it in is time consuming and takes longer, often more effort than just doing it myself. So, you know, that probably wasn't good for me to do that, but actually I just didn't have the patience to wait for people and to keep chasing people and saying, have you managed to do it? I'm saying people, of course it wasn't everybody. There were some who were very efficient at editing and returning and saying exactly that I can do it by this week, I can't do it by that week. I mean, Jen Altman was one of those. She knew exactly, and she stuck to her deadlines. You know, I can do it by this time. But there were others who, you know, I'd send it out and wouldn't hear anything, and then I'd chase, and then I wouldn't hear anything, and I thought I could have done it by now. You know, so that was an interesting process that I went through. So I ended up doing a lot more of it myself than maybe I envisaged at the beginning. And then my daughter, I can't remember when she came in, she has got young children, and so she was looking for some work. And I said to her, oh, you could be my administrator. I'm looking for an administrator. So she became my administrator. And as part
What's your daughter's name?
Abby Eva.
Okay.
As part of that, she took on some of the editing, and actually she turned out to be really good and efficient, and, you know, got the work done in time and that sort of stuff. So that was an interesting process. Having worked initially with my ex-husband, here I am working now with my daughter. And she took over a lot of the administration of the website and that sort of stuff. And that was a huge relief to me, because I've, you know, technology-wise, I'm 10 years behind, 20 years behind probably than she is. And interestingly now, and I'm jumping time-wise, we'll have to reshift this, she's setting up her own business, and so she's pulling out.
Okay.
Interesting time-wise. I've now got another administrator stepping in, so it won't really be involved with the journal. Abby will still do anything that still involves the website, but she's basically pulling back. Yeah, so lots of changes. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So in the initial 5 or so years of running the journal, what for you were the most pressing or interesting elements or aspects that were taking place in the wider field?
Well, again, I'm not accurate on the in terms of the history of when things changed, but certainly when I first went to what was Zist originally, it became Bairn Reed, but it was Zist originally. Can't remember what Zist stands for, but I can find out. They had a different venue then. Bert was involved. And then the split must have happened over the next few years. So probably was in those first 5 years. And this is interesting, because of my original vision, was very keen to keep all parts in the journal. so still hoping to get articles from Bert, but also articles from Hunter and, other people who had been part of the split. So initially, I would say I was just getting random articles from various people who I didn't know and got to know as a result of those articles coming in. In the very first journal, which was still called the Systemic Solutions Bulletin, was a very interesting article because it kind of conveyed something really important. It was a discussion between Eva Madelung, who was, again, she was somebody who was around in the early days. I didn't have a lot of contact with her, probably because she was mostly German speaking. I'm not sure why that was. Anyway, but she was a figural person in Germany, definitely. So the discussion was between her, Jakob Schneider, who I knew well from Germany, Hunter, and Wilfried de Philippe, and he was somebody who was involved when Barbara and Jutta were running the journal. I think he was part of their editorial team or advisory team. And the discussion was around bowing and the tension between that becoming a superego thing, I must bow to my parents, and the links with submission and subservience and that sort of thing, and the sacred aspect of bowing. And so that was a really interesting discussion that came in the very first issue. And I still refer back to it at times because, that one has stayed with me. And there are one or two before I even knew of Stefan's existence who wrote about illness as well. So I was interested in that. And one that Bert wrote where there's a woman in Hong Kong, I think it was, with 11 illnesses, and they all surrounded the client, the representatives all surrounded the client, these 11 people. And it turned out that I think it was the grandmother had given away 11 children. So it's interesting that stayed with me.
That is interesting. That's
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah. So in those early days, I would have at least one article from Bert, and sometimes one at the beginning and one at the end. That's a sort of in case, if you like, what was happening. Then when the whole split and the ISKA stuff happened, then there was a lot of controversial stuff that went on and different points of view. And looking back on that, I think the role of being inclusive is it's a bit like being a diplomat, I imagine, because I got from both sides stuff coming towards me that actually was about those two sides, so I got entangled in it, really. So that was a learning. And then in issue 12, I interviewed Bert. And I don't again know, I think that was probably just after the split. So we can find out what the year of that was. And I remember asking him, how do you feel about what's happened? And he said, it's fine, this is the movement of the work and this is the movement of the field, and they do their thing and I do my thing. And, so he'd obviously got beyond the initial, because I think there were a lot of hurt feelings on both sides initially.
Do you think that perhaps the journal fulfilled an unforeseen function in that time, and perhaps at subsequent times when in the field of practice there have been disagreements, conflicts, falling outs, such as the lot of people, of humans. But do you think there's been an unanticipated function of actually being a holding space where all of those diverse perspectives have actually been able to be aired, and the fact that people have had to write about a situation, write about their feelings in regards to an event or a confrontation, etc., has somehow been part of the, both for the individual but also in the wider field, a demonstration of how we process emotion, of how we manage or negotiate difference.
Absolutely. You know, it would be really good to look back and read through some of those periods of time, you know, where these splits happened. Because I do remember like getting an article from one person and then saying to somebody who I knew was on the other side, if you like,
Hmm?
this article's going into the journal. Do you want to respond to it? You know, so sometimes the response and the original article was in the same journal, and sometimes the response would be in the following one.
Right.
So there was another time when Bert was talking about, and I always get these two mixed up, is it Don Juan or Don Quixote? Don Juan, I think. He said he'd met the grandson or something of Don Juan. I can't remember the details. And Dan Cohen said, nonsense, you know, in terms of dates, that doesn't fit at all. So I published that, and I published what Bird said. And then Francesca, and I didn't publish this, but it was so helpful. She said to me, this is two people from such totally different paradigms, they don't understand each other. And it was like, oh gosh, this really says a lot about what happens when people get into them and us. You know, because she
Yes.
said in her ancestry, loads of people take each other's names and they call each other brother and sister and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, oh, okay. And this thing of dates is not relevant, you know. So it's like the Western way of thinking versus something else much more ancient and tribal, you know. So interesting, you know, that on paper it looks like this is stuff and nonsense from a Western viewpoint. So many assumptions that get made. And so that was a big learning for me, you know, and I tried to kind of keep that attitude like, oh, this is interesting, you know, feeling my own reactivity. Oh, yeah, but this is interesting too. Yeah. So that happened with Franz Rupert. So again, you can track back. You know, I used to work with Franz Rupert.
Okay.
He worked very similarly to how I work in the early days, and I loved working with him. And then it evolved. He changed. Something changed, and there was an interview in the journal with Vivian Broughton, who's still working with him as far as I know, where she started to question what he was saying, and then she obviously discovered more and then went further down that route with him. And then at a certain point, he split himself off from well, he may say he didn't split himself off, that he got excluded, I don't know. But there was a separation between Franz Rupert and the constellation field. And again, there was a period there where I was publishing both until he stopped. And he created a real separation and moved away, stopped using the word constellation and stopped using the word soul. So, you know,
Okay.
then it was separate. But Angwin was involved with that. She's another person who has been a kind of a support from the point of view of submitting articles.
Mm.
A good writer, and of course it was a mutual thing because it helped her in terms of her books, but it was also that she was willing to submit articles until last issue when she said, I'm not doing any more. Her husband died
Right.
about a year ago, I think, something like that, and he provided all the photos and backup for her. So whether it was that or just her own age, I mean, she's 80 odd, I think. So, you know, so yes, she's been another pivotal person in terms of the articles that have come in, and I've really enjoyed her articles. They're very informative. She's a historian, you know, that has been an important aspect for me. And then, you know, I don't know what point, because, you know, Angwin was the person we invited to do the colonialism workshop in Bristol. I
Mm.
don't remember what year that was. And you know, my interest in the multicultural aspect of constellation work was sparked.
Okay.
Must have been prior to that, because I don't know. You know, I just remember sitting around a lunch table with her and with Lynn and maybe a couple of other people, and we just hatched this idea, you know, to have this workshop. And that's how I, met you after that workshop. And so then there was another way of sort of, okay, I want to be more inclusive of people of color, black and brown bodied people. And I got to know Tanya. And I hadn't known her well. I'd met her in Germany a couple of times, but our contact deepened at that point, and she's been really, really supportive again. And I brought her and Lindy Way onto the advisory board
Mm.
to help with that. But it's kind of came in at the time when I was also thinking about, oh, am I going to stop and that sort of stuff. So it wasn't at the height of my energy, if you like.
Okay.
But there are a fair number of articles in there that are really informative and from multicultural backgrounds, So that was another, if I were carrying on, I think that would develop more. There's
Mm.
one coming in this journal. Well, there's two actually. There's a woman from Pakistan who's written about oh, Islam. Yeah, that's the word for a moment. Beautiful, beautiful.
Mm. Mm.
And then another woman. Do you know Zita? Can't remember her surname now.
I think I know of Zita rather
Yeah,
than know her personally.
trained with CSC. Anyway,
Yeah.
I can't remember why I had some contact with her, and she submitted an article, very interesting, a different take
Mm.
um, on what should we call it? Racism. It's not really on racism even. Maybe I'll send it to you because it's an interesting article.
Okay.
So the field is developing there, and who knows? I just think, well, if I let it go, maybe it'll be picked up in a different way.
Okay. So I think, of course, it's very, very hard ever to predict how a sector, how a modality will develop. But one question I would like to ask you is, given you have had, in a way, this quite unique position within the field of constellations work, what would you say has been the most beneficial part of this journey in regards to the exposure you've had to the international community and how that has informed your own practice as a constellator and as a trainer of constellators?
Mm. Mm. Well, I mean, it's interesting in terms of noticing my emotional journey through this, because I can see as I'm talking that the relationships I've formed with people has been the most important part. And it's really interesting when you can get an article from somebody you have never met,
Right.
uh, that I can sort of get a sense of the person, even though I haven't met them. um, and I've never sort of checked it out. I mean, there's some people I did then meet, in Germany and this sort of stuff. But that's been a fascinating learning. Like, now don't make any assumptions about this person.
Mm.
So I think that's the biggest learning, the most beneficial bit for me, the learning of what the field really is. So I've kind of got it on a different level, not just on a understanding level. I've got it on a heart level,
Right.
because I've seen so much conflict, controversy, opposing viewpoints, all gathered and coming together, and not necessarily resolvable, and quite often not resolved, and agreements to split and that sort of thing. But that is really, it's helped me in my practice, definitely, as a workshop facilitator and as a trainer.
Mm.
And it's very painful, very difficult at times, for sure. And I
Mm.
know I'm on a steep learning curve where multiculturalism is concerned, definitely. But again, I've learned quite a bit already from that, through the journal, and just reading articles and seeing people's different perspective, and where they're coming from with it. And that, you know, I used to love the personal stories that people wrote, of their own personal journey through constellation work and how
Mm,
constellations
mm,
helped. And then there was one, probably the most challenging article I had was from a paedophile, and it shook me. You know, it shook me on a personal level, but it also shook me on a kind of a, it brought up all my judgments and that sort of stuff. Um, and I, I had a sort of initial wish to reject, and this guy wanted to remain anonymous and everything. And then I somehow managed to move through that and to see as another human being. And you know, he wrote the article, and it was Judith who worked with him. And I mean, it's very, very moving to see his journey,
mm.
you know, where he started from and where he got to in the end, and how constellations had helped him.
So that sounds like a useful um, reference point um, in terms of the kinds of issues that were brought to your attention
Um,
that people had been working with whether that be with an individual or within a particular sector of therapeutic practice.
um,
And I wonder, first of all, with that particular instance, whether there was what kind of reaction or response there was to that particular article, but moreover, what kind of shifts you have become aware of, any particular pivotal moments or periods of time. You made reference to personally becoming more aware of diversity and different cultural perspectives on the work. And of course, we think of the work as having its origin in a European context. So I just wondered if you feel or if you have a sense that there's been a more expansive expression of the work from other cultural perspectives, from other geographic locations, or whether you feel, in terms of the range of contributors, it's remained very much a European conversation or not.
mm. I would say, I mean, again, I would have to check this, but I would say it's probably dominated by the European context, but you know, it's not being exclusively European by any means.
Mm,
I mean, Colette got very involved with India, and you know, we had some articles come through, some beautiful articles come through from India. So you know, that was one. Then my contact with Tanya meant that we got stuff from South Africa, you know, and Mexico. And I have contacts in Mexico, you know, so um, I would say yes, predominantly, without counting up the articles, predominantly European. Um,
okay.
American, I mean, Americans have been very vociferous. They send a lot of articles. So there's that. And interestingly, I mean, you were saying about the responses to the paedophile article. I didn't get any response at all, which is really interesting. And that was something that I never really got off the ground. So Don O'Patterney, he is another person, can't remember at what stage. He helped me change the website. He helped finance it,
Mm.
and he helped by suggesting bringing in a chatting forum. Can't remember what the word is. You know, where you talk about.
Oh, a forum.
Yes, a forum, but
Okay.
it never really took off. And I
Right.
don't know if it's because I didn't put enough energy into it. It's possible. Because I had a chat a couple of years ago when they had that very big, I think it was ISCA conference, where they had lots of translators. And I talked to them about translating aspects of the journal, or articles in the journal. And there were a couple, and they're quite young, you know, they're probably in their 30s, 20s, 30s. A couple of them said to me, the days of 100-page journals are gone.
Right.
What you need is regular input every day or every week of short, sharp.
Mm.
And I just felt this no in me. No, that's not me. That's just not me. And of course, there are those who still want a 100-page journal, but you know, in terms of movements of the field, that may
Yes.
well be an aspect. More technology, more online. Um, the journals now online, you know, and younger population who are fast moving, technologically involved, you know, enjoy short, sharp Instagram inputs, you know. That's also an indicator for me that that's not me. I don't know why I'm coughing. Part of the letting go, I think. So your question was quite long. Did I cover each aspect?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Because what I, you know, at the center of what I was asking, I think, was whether you had seen any kind of shift from a European orientation of contributors and themes to a more diverse range of geographic contributions and culturally oriented contributions. And I think I understood from what you said by way of response that there had been an increase, if you like, there had been a greater diversity over time of where articles had been submitted from and what themes they were exploring, but that the predominant contributions were European and American.
Mm. Yeah, I would say that's true. The
Mm,
other aspect I was thinking of as I was listening to you was, in a way, in line with constellation work, it's not a linear process.
mm,
You know, so there's an issue, I think it's issue 26 that stands out for me, that was full of African, you know, there was actually an English woman who went to Africa and she's a storyteller. And then there was a Kenyan guy who submitted something about his tribe. And, you know, that issue was full of stuff from beyond Europe. And you know, I didn't know then, is this going to be a trend? No, it wasn't. You know, it was just a, so I don't see it. You know, this is another learning for me. It's not a linear process, that the involvement, evolution of the field isn't linear.
right,
It's like this. So it's coming from all different directions, you know, and so I wouldn't want to be somebody who predicts where it's going, because I really don't know. I mean, there's this new thing, CI, that's created again another controversy. And if I weren't finishing the journal, I think
okay,
there would be ongoing different points of view on what's
right.
happening with that. Um,
So you've mentioned actually on a couple of occasions, you've referred to splits and divisions and controversies and disagreements. And I just wondered from your perspective now that these are, in a way, necessary, inevitable developments in a field of practice as it matures, as more people from diverse backgrounds, both professionally, culturally, ethnically, geographically, come into contact with the work, they're necessarily going to interpret it through the lens they have available to them, which is, of course, informed by their own cultural identities.
yeah, I mean, when you say that, then I am conscious of that, you know, there is a loss to the field of me stopping this. I mean, and maybe somebody else will pick it up again. I don't know.
Mm,
But you know, I remember Bert's. This is way back, and I'm also thinking about. See, I'm not thinking linearly now. I'm doing this cycling with
fine.
Angwin talking about fractals, you know.
Right.
So here we have an initial fractal after Bert first came to England. I had no idea. I'd been up in Hertfordshire running workshops, poodling along in my own way, you know, and then I got hauled in, if you like, because I got involved with the journal and I saw, oh my God, there's all these splits. I had no idea. Um, and I wrote to Bert and I said to him, next time you come to London, you know, would you be willing to do a constellation for those of us who are involved with the work? Because there's all sorts of splits and difficulties. And he wrote this letter, and it's in here. Strife and division are necessary and inevitable. My advice to you is not to comment upon the activities of others and not to allow other people's comments to affect your own activities. That way you'll have peace in everything you do. As I work in this way too, I do not propose to comment on your request. It's just beautiful, you know. I refer to it as one of Bert's gems, you know,
Mhm.
because it just made so much sense. And so it made me then view these divisions differently.
Right.
Now what's happening with CI, I think is really, I don't know if you know much about that. I don't know a lot of detail. I just know that there's a separate force that's being formed and that there's some legal difficulty between ISCA and CI and how it was formed and mailing this. Not that interested, to be honest, but what I am interested in is the fractal. Yeah? So
Right.
the fractal is, I don't know how many years before, but first of all in England, but also with ISCA, the formation of ISCA and the Hellinger Scientia, very similar dynamic to what's now happening with
Mm.
ISCA and CI. So here's the repeat. And I saw when I went to Germany, this is in lots of countries. So I mentioned something in Mexico. Oh, why don't you contact so and so and so and so? And they went, no, never the twain shall meet. You know, Netherlands, same thing. Oh no, you know, we don't talk to this. So these splits were everywhere.
Yeah, and I guess what they're really indicative of isn't about a particular professional sector. They're indicative of this is how people are, and
Yes,
this is what happens within communities.
yes,
And although we have the lens of being part of a helping profession, a therapeutic profession, that doesn't give us a special pass in terms of our fundamental nature and
that's
our
right.
fundamental drives
That's
and our
right.
fundamental needs.
Yeah.
They will be expressed, notwithstanding our professional title or our professional orientation.
Mm, It's so interesting, that, isn't it? I don't know if you've read that book. I can't remember what it's called now. About the people in Ladakh, ancient cultures, is it? Ancient cultures, where they talked about how the people in Ladakh were a very smooth running, cooperative group of people. Like
Hmm.
everyone had their place, and you know, it was peaceful. In came the West. You know, Western people came in, and in a way, they ruined it. You know, their input interfered with what had been working really well.
Right.
And then people became, you know, unemployed and competitive. And I mean, wherever that's happened, you know, like Australia,
Hmm.
Africa, you know, there's been havoc. And yes, you could argue that that's also a part of the evolution, but it's interesting to go back to some of these smaller communities and smaller tribes and see that actually they worked very well before some other
Yes.
input from outside came in.
Well, that might be a potentially more far-reaching conversation
Yes,
uh,
yes,
with more with more multifaceted elements for another day.
yes,
But I take your point about how um, systems can run seemingly very well and very cohesively for significant periods of time and can be interrupted
Yeah.
and can be made asymmetrical by the intervention of others
Yeah.
from a different cultural perspective with a different set of values, let's say that much,
Yeah.
perhaps for today.
I mean, I
Uh,
think it does link into, what happened with Bert. I mean, again, this is something that I've learned from doing the journal, but also from being a trainer and whatnot, is to just not make any assumptions about anything or anyone. Because there's been stuff written by people that supposedly came from Bert that didn't come from Bert. Like
okay,
the origin of the word constellation, there was a lot of discussion around that, and I thought, well, let's go straight to the horse's mouth and ask Bert, how did that word come come to pass? How come we got this English word constellation? Because the German word is very prosaic. He's setting up of or something. I can't remember. Aufstellung, the setting up of something. And he said, I have no idea. Like it just came out of the field somewhere.
right,
Because when we started in England, it was, first of all, the order of, or touching love, the order of love. Somebody said it makes it sound like a cult, so they changed it to the orders of love. That was the title of my early workshops, the orders of love. And then somehow, I don't know how we got to the word constellations. It's fascinating, isn't it?
well, it
So that
seems
impulse,
that we're doing this work, we're leaning into um, pre-existing organic processes,
yes.
pre-existing um, systems,
Mm,
energetic systems, and in a way, how we came or how we come as practitioners and as a community to articulate that process and our experience of encountering these processes also evolves as we gain more experience, perhaps more exposure, greater insight, and appreciation. We find a more appropriate language.
yeah. Yeah.
And language, by its nature, isn't fixed,
No.
is also dynamic,
Mm,
is also responsive in some way or another.
yeah. And then you have the complication of something that's international, of translation and what
Yes.
gets lost in translation. And I remember asking Bert about that, like, how do you feel about your work being translated?
Mm,
And, again, this is like from a German perspective. He said, oh, I've got this great translator and she's done this and this and this. But I could see from the evolution of his written work
right.
that the essence of what he was about was lost in the later books because the subtlety of the English language is missing. Like,
Right.
how it is in German, you translate that as a German into English, and there's a subtlety. It needs retranslating, if you like,
Right. Yeah.
after the initial translation. Now, Colleen Beaumont, she was involved with the translation of the original Love, Sin and Symmetry. And I don't know if it was with Hunter or, how that happened, but that's well translated. And some of
Okay.
his earlier books were well translated.
Right.
And I'm saying this from, obviously, this is my personal stance on it, just following him and feeling the essence of
Mm.
what he talks about. And he was perfectly able to speak English, So he didn't really need to. Maybe it was just easier for him in terms of writing to do it in German,
Mm.
because the translation lost his soul, if you like. The
Okay.
soul aspect was gone.
Right.
And, when I went to Germany to Hellinger Ciencia, only went once. The translation was frustrating for me. It's like I took my earphones out in the end and I thought I'll just listen to the essence. I know a bit of German, but it was jarring. And
Okay.
it's not that those people aren't probably brilliant translators. That's not what it's about. It's that
Well, I guess that's one of the challenges, isn't it? that at a professional level, translation is a technical discipline,
Yes.
and it's more appropriate, perhaps, to think of constellations work as being at a different place on the continuum, more of a poetic place.
Mm, mm,
And just as it would be perhaps um, strange to an engineer of whatever description to read a technical manual written by a poet,
yeah.
similarly, a conventional, so to speak, translator is doing a technical job. They're
Yeah.
not they're not engaged at the soul level. They're
Yeah.
not engaged at an aesthetic level. It's a different sensibility.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really true. And interesting. It makes me think forward, like, what's going to happen? Will there be other journals in different languages? And is that necessarily so? Like if you do a translation, can you get someone who can translate and translate it in the way that you grasp the soul of it? I mean, I've worked in Romania for I don't know how many years, 12, 13 years. I've been very lucky. I've had really good translators who know the work
Right.
and know me.
Mm,
They know where I'm coming from, so they could translate in a way that picks up the essence uh,
right.
of what
Well, I
I'm
guess
trying
what
to
you're referring to is something you touched on much earlier, particularly in regards to the support that was available to you and has remained available to you in regards to being a publisher and an editor, which is relationships and relational dynamics,
Yeah,
and how those relationships really perhaps are the glue that helps the work to be empathetically appreciated, better appreciated, with some sense of interiority, you know, the
yeah.
subjectivity of being engaged with the work,
Mm,
which is a very different perspective than that brought by someone who's looking at it from a technical, if you like, in inverted commas, objective perspective.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sure there's a like for like translation of um, emotion, for example, as a word across all languages,
yeah.
but finding the right nuance to contextualize that requires a different kind of appreciation or subtlety.
Mm, mm.
And that's a challenge, I guess, in translation generally, not specifically in the field of constellations work.
Yeah, I mean, that's been another aspect really in the journal, like people writing from different cultures and English is not their first language,
Yeah.
having to try and grasp the essence of what they're trying to say.
Mm,
That was been a really big learning for me, that how that happens. And now you remember when in the early days when Bert went, I think it was the first visit to Greece. He went to Greece and this guy, Dimitris Stavropoulos, who had an article in issue 10, I think it was, he got two young girls to do the translation. And poor lasses, they were exposed to constellation work probably for the first time. They became emotional.
mm,
It was really difficult for them, and he got really impatient with them. No, 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 that's not what he's saying, you know. And then there was another person in Poland that I only knew this because I went with Barbara, who was Polish origin, uh, who stood up and said on the stage, translated a sentence that Berta said and changed the meaning, flipped it round completely. And
mm.
he'd said, I just want you to forget, don't want you to remember me after this or something. And she said, I want you to remember me.
Right.
So, and Barbara went like that, I wouldn't
Okay.
have known.
Mm,
So
mm.
it shows what can go awry, in terms of translation. So I was very conscious of that with some of the articles that came through.
Right.
if I wasn't translating directly from the language, but trying to translate from their perspective coming into English,
Yes.
not their first language. There would be exchanges of, is this what you're trying to say? Is it this that you're trying to say, to sort of make sure I didn't go too far away from the essence of what their intention was in the
So
article.
I guess that's one of the challenges and one of the learning curves of being an editor of an English language journal with international contributors.
That's right. Yeah.
And I guess that's something that at the outset one doesn't really have a sense of. It's only when you're well into the process and well into the role that you appreciate those subtleties, those nuances and facets
Mm.
of what it is to be an editor.
Yeah. I mean, I became very sensitive to, like, long English words or technical words or involved English words, and I would say somebody in Mexico is not going to get that, you know. So you need to put a note, an explanatory note to help with that. So I kind of held that quite dear, and also with the American articles, I got very. I mean, Francesca got used to it. I got on my high horse. I will not have American spellings in this journal. So that, you could argue that in lots of different ways, but I felt very certain about that, except when it was a book extract, then
Right.
of course, then the American spelling stay, or somebody insisted, then I would put an editor's note at the bottom saying they insist on the American
Okay.
spelling staying, But Angren was very good about that, hers was full of American spellings, but she didn't object that I changed them all to English.
Okay.
Yeah, so
So
interesting.
I wonder if I might ask
Mm.
what you feel has been the single most um, beneficial insight you've gained from your experience of publishing and editing the knowing field over the years, and what it is, or rather how you feel that particular insight will continue to serve your personal work going forward.
Mm. I think it's to take time to really, if you sort of get an article and you get an initial reactivity to it, to take time to get into who is this person, what is it they're really trying to convey, what are they trying to get across in the written word, and there is a difference between the written word and the spoken word, but in a way that's the same insight. Like, don't leap to reactivity or leap to assumptions or leap to conclusions too soon. Take your time. And with the advantage with the written word is, okay, let me just leave it. I'm thinking about this paedophile article now. Let me just leave it a couple of days
Yes.
and I'll revisit, and then I'll read it again. Or I'll send it to somebody else and say, what do you think about this? To check out my own response or reactivity and just see, is someone else aligned with me in terms of that? So I think that's the biggest insight, like, that people are so different. Even if you just sit in England, they're also different, but when you go across the world, there are so many assumptions made in all sorts of different ways. And that is now included as an active part of my training on the very first day of the very first module. Wander around, meet people, and see what your assumptions are, and then
Right.
check them out.
Yes.
Because it just feels so important, that, because I think it creates, I was going to say war, it creates havoc,
Hmm.
the assumptions that we make about people. And can we really hear what they're trying to say, whether it's the written word or the spoken word? And we may have to sit with them for a while before we get to what it is they're really trying to say, to
Right.
come down through the layers, and then if you've got the complication of a translated article on top of that, I think that's like another layer to it. So it is complicated.
Okay.
And I would say, that's the thing with Bert, that he didn't seem to, I mean, whether he did privately, he didn't seem to worry about what people thought about him and the assumptions people made about him and are still making about him. That he didn't ever. I remember Albrecht saying to him, "Why do you not defend yourself? When these newspapers are rubbishing you and calling you a Nazi and all this sort of stuff." And he just said, "What for? What for? They're just out to get me. There's no point."
Hmm.
So he kind of stayed back from all of that. And in a way, I've done the opposite. I've gone in there to try and understand it more. So,
Hmm.
it's interesting that I valued so much of his philosophy and the words he said, but I did the opposite of what he suggested. Don't comment upon other people's activities. I've done a lot of publishing people's comments on others' activities. So it's just the other end of the continuum. But yeah, that's my biggest insight, really. Yeah.
Okay. And in looking at the movement in the wider field of constellations practice, what would be your greatest wish in terms of how the field continues to develop?
I mean, I know that this is probably not possible, but my greatest wish would be that the soul, the sacred aspect, doesn't get lost. And my greatest fear is that it will.
Okay, so just to pick up on that, because that seems like a very, very important dimension of the work, I'm genuinely curious to ask you, given all of the experience you have as a trainer in many contexts, the extent to which that aspect of the work is teachable. I'm curious, as it's a bit, what's the analogy that I could use? Actually, I'm not going to go with an analogy. I'll just stay with that
I get what you're
question.
saying. I get what you're saying.
Mm,
It's for me similar to being a parent. It's like it's how you model it. It's in your
right.
essence. So in your presence.
Mm,
I can teach people about the various aspects of what helps you to be present. And I do, and people
yes.
practice that and all that sort of thing. But in the end, they pick it up on that visceral level. And that's, with Bird, when a lot of people said, well, he doesn't really teach, which was true, because he just modeled
Right.
and you could feel it.
Mm,
And some people never felt it. They never got to that level. They would just see him on he's a harsh man, or he does this, or he does that, and everything else. You have to be able to drop down yourself
right.
to touch that level of the work. And I do try and convey that, but I'm only really conveying it by my presence.
Mm. So I'm
And
just
so,
wondering, with the way you're responding, whether there's something about a particular kind of maturity that's
mhm.
perhaps actually required to do the work. And part of my reason for framing this question in this way is when I observe how I came to the work myself. I was in my 40s, and when I look at the majority of practitioners that I meet, they're people at least in the middle stage of their lives, and I've yet to meet any much younger adults doing this work. So I just wonder if there's a certain kind of life experience that is required to have sufficient resourcing to do this work and to meet the challenges and issues and situations that presenting clients bring to bear.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I remember, funny enough, Jan Jacob Stam saying we need to take care of the next generation, you know, the successors with this work. Because I do, I mean, I've got one, where is she from? Lithuanian woman on my training at the moment. She's in her 20s.
Okay.
We ordered people in terms of age, you know, really interesting. So she was obviously right around this end of the circle. And yes, there is something in terms of weight, like spiritual weight, emotional weight that you get over time,
Right.
whether that be as a parent, grandparent, or whether it be as a facilitator, trainer, or whatever. And, you know, the one thing that I've really held dear, it's interesting how this overlaps with the editorship of the journal, is humility.
Right.
Like, I will not have somebody come and do the training who says, oh, well, can I just do this module, that module? Because I've done da 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 da. No, you haven't. You have not worked with me over a period of time. So you start, whoever you are, Queen of England, you know, you start at the grassroots level, the same as everybody else. And that feels really important. And that's similar with the journal. I don't care if you're, you know, the top academic of such and such a university, or if you sweep the streets, you know, if you've got something to say, you're welcome. Actually, I feel quite emotional as I say that.
Right.
That's really important to me.
Hmm.
And, you know, that's part of my own background, I guess, you know, very working class and, you know, fighting my way through, if you like. And there's something about that that's really dear to me. Like, you can do this. You can do what you want in life. You just need to get the right support, know where to ask for support, and have the vision and the drive to do it.
Right.
And then anything becomes possible.
So it's very interesting to me that in this context you reference your personal background and you frame that in class terms, because one of my observations in being a practitioner and participating in workshops and seminars, and of course the the kinds of issues that clients bring to be constellated, is that in my experience, I can only speak about in my experience, the wider systemic drivers that inform our experience as individuals and within our family settings somehow seems quite absent in a lot of the framing of the work. And I wonder if that's something that's been an observation for you. And when I say these wider framings, I mean about class and gender and identity and economics. Of course, these dimensions have a bearing, and whatever we understand about orders of love or first principles within family systems, these other dynamics must surely inform these principles.
Yeah, I mean, this is the dilemma with working phenomenologically, you know. It's impossible really to do it fully because of that aspect. You know, like there's an Irish woman who was married to a Kenyan guy. It was funny enough, the same guy that submitted this article, who said, you know, the concept of family is very different. The whole, you know, the matriarchal society, she has to join his tribe,
Right.
and leave her own origins, you know, and those
Yes.
sorts of things that you know, we yeah, as a community, don't take enough account of all those differences. And I think the,
Mm.
the upcoming thing of transgender and, non-binary and all this sort of thing, there was a big thing on Constellation Talk about it. I don't know if you followed it, but,
Yes.
where one woman who was running a workshop fell foul of, the principles of constellation work and how she was going to get across to these transgender people. And it was I think, a very rich exchange, even though it was extremely painful.
Mm.
And I did the same, got the two a transgender guy and the woman who ran the workshop to submit something. And so that came together. But that's another evolution in the field that needs including, and
Mm.
how far can we stretch in terms of, and I think that's true. And maybe there'll be a few pioneers for that, like for bringing in those wider issues and making them more overt, if you like.
Mm. Mm.
Because the only way otherwise is you come across an individual who challenges your assumption, and that's on such a small level that
Right.
you can't embrace it in terms of the wider field in the same way. So, I think there's something really important that you're onto there with that.
Mm.
How do we stretch that out? But that's also, see, this is interesting. That's also to do with the individualist attitude of the Western world.
Right.
We operate as individuals, and getting across and I've tried the paradigm shift that's needed to say, yes, I'm Barbara Morgan, but my goodness me, I'm part of so much more
Mm.
systemic stuff than this little individual here. That's not what's important. It's the much bigger picture that's important. And that's a paradigm shift that's needed in a society that's very individualistic. And people who come to workshops, they say, oh, have you got a different price for if I want to do a constellation and if I don't, and I only want to come if I know I'm going to do a constellation. And I go, oh, here we go again. They haven't got the basic principle of constellation work, which is you become part of a field and you see what emerges from the field. And you often get far more as a representative or sitting in the holder group than you do as a client because you're less invested. That's not got through to so many people, and it's a frustration for me. But I hold true to the principle of it.
Right.
No, there's no differentiation for me. You pay the same price as anyone else who's coming, unless you're, hard up and need a bursary, or that's a different issue. But in terms of accessibility to doing your own constellation, let's see what emerges.
Right.
But a lot of facilitators don't work that way. So it's difficult. Yeah? They offer a grading, and Franz Rupert used to get a list. You put your name on the list, and if you didn't get to do your constellation this time, you'd be top of the list next time. It was all I don't know if he does that now, but it was all pre-arranged. That's not constellation work for me. That's not working with the wider field at all.
Mm. Mm.
So, it's an interesting principle. And I think what you're picking up on is the assumptions that are made from where we come from and what we're not consciously, and I'm saying we in the West are not consciously aware of.
Mm. Mm.
The duality, right, wrong, the good, bad, the judgment, perpetrators are bad, victims are good, all that stuff, forgiveness, it's a huge thing. But at the bottom is the paradigm shift that's needed if you're really going to embrace constellation work. And many people can't make that paradigm shift, or won't. I'm not sure which it is, because it's too hard to stand in a place that's at odds with the society that you're in.
Very interesting. Well, maybe that's a good place for us to pause for today. It feels like we've covered a lot of ground from both the origin of your engagement with taking on the journal, some of the personal challenges and successes that you've experienced in that journey, and some of the dynamics that you've been witness to and have supported, having a platform to be articulated in regards to developments in the wider field. So that, to me, feels like a good place um, to pause, unless, of course, there's some burning element that you feel it very necessary to say something more about, or something about, if you haven't already touched on it.
No, I think this is a good place to stop. You know, it's interesting how it's kind of panned out, isn't it? It's kind of somehow included much more of my own philosophy on life, if you like.
Well,
And
maybe that was an inevitability,
yes, and it's not separate. You know, it's
not
like
separate.
me, Barbara the editor is Barbara the Barbara, you know, Barbara the trainer is Barbara the Barbara, you know. Um,
Absolutely.
it's just who I am, and I guess that's another aspect, you know, being aligned with what you're doing really helps, you know, and I feel aligned with constellation work,
Mm,
whether it be as an editor or trainer or a facilitator or someone just talking to another person about it.
right.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
coming from a very, what's the word, heartfelt place. Yeah,
Great.
yeah.
Thank you. Well, Barbara, I really appreciate your time today.
And thank you.
It's been very illuminating, very inspiring, very enriching, and I look forward to seeing it in print,
Yes.
so to speak.
It'd be interesting to see whether I feel a pull to turn it into a linear process, you know.
Well, let's see what emerges.
Yeah, okay, great. And I'm happy for you to do whatever you think is needed with it. Yeah. And
Okay.
if I do get other memories or insights that feel really important to include, I'll let you know. Yeah.
Okay. All good.
Stuart, that's
Well,
really great.
I'm going to switch out of recording mode
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.